You just can't beg and plead when you don't have leverage. You have to come up with something that actually gives the other person something. So begging and pleading is not a negotiating strategy. Hi, welcome to another episode of Baktari MD. As you know, this season we're going to be talking about Crash CEO School, where we go over strategies in terms of leadership, whether you're the CEO or just involved in leadership in any organization. We're going to be talking about skill sets that almost anyone can use to help grow an organization. Today, what I want to talk about is a broad topic called negotiations. Now, I know there's tons of books on how to negotiate, negotiating strategies, and really what I wanted to do in this episode is just give you A to Z strategy on how to approach negotiations. Obviously, negotiations can involve many things in an organization. It can involve negotiating within the organization, outside the organization. But really the gist of this is how you and your company can negotiate with other entities, other organizations to help grow your company. So I think part of negotiating is obviously trying to figure out what to do that's best for your company, but obviously wanting to do it in a way that you can attract and work with as many people as possible or as many companies as possible. Because in the long run, every company needs trusted partners and vendors that they can work with. But how do you develop those relationships and how do you start those negotiations? And what are some of the pitfalls you need to look for when you're trying to negotiate for your company, especially with outside vendors and outside providers and outside sources of materials and what have you for your company? So, there's a couple of things that I want to talk about negotiation, and probably many of you have heard this phrase that when it comes to negotiations, you don't necessarily get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And, that sounds like a cute phrase, but nothing could be more true. Because depending on how you negotiate can really determine with what you wind up with. People feel that, who haven't really negotiated a lot, that there's some sort of natural thing that both parties get based on what they deserve or based on the hierarchy of the relationship. But I have seen people who probably didn't deserve to get a certain deal get it, and vice versa. So a lot of it has to do with how you present yourself and some of the real do's and don'ts in negotiation. But starting off with my number one and number two rule. My number one rule in negotiation is always negotiate in good faith. And that's a really tough one to put into a few words, but basically you want to be a legitimate partner in the negotiation. So if you really are not serious or don't have the capacity to deliver on what you're saying, probably behooves you not to negotiate. This idea that someone's negotiating in good faith means that they really are at the table, they really want to cut a deal, and they want a win-win. Now, what's interesting is when you come across someone across the table who's not negotiating in good faith, that's often very easy to recognize and leaves a really bad taste in people's mouth, where you just say, this party just doesn't really want to do a deal or is wasting my time or, is just a bottom feeder who just wants everything to be their way. So if you're not prepared to do a win-win deal where both sides come out ahead, you're probably not going to be negotiating in good faith. So be cognizant of that. Before entering any of these situations, just ask yourself, is this a deal I want to do? Can I afford this deal? Can I deliver what I'm going to promise? And can I set up an arrangement that's win-win? So negotiating in good faith is a key point. The other thing is never negotiate unless you're ready to buy. Okay, so there's a difference between negotiating and getting information. So if you just want to get information from a company and you just want to set up a meeting, say, hey, I want to better understand your services, that's one thing. But if you let on or pretend that you are ready to buy and then get the deal that you want and then back off, that's going to send a very bad message. And often you don't get a second bite at the apple. So you got to really understand, if you're not ready to buy, if let's say you're looking for someone to provide video services for your company, but you're really not ready to buy, I wouldn't sit there and bring someone in and grill them and beat them up on the best price only to say, well, we'll let you know next quarter if we're interested in these services. Now, that doesn't mean you can't meet with people and just get information and what have you, but just be cognizant that if you're not ready to buy, I wouldn't go into the throes and into the depths of negotiation and really beat them up on their best price and their best terms if you're not ready to buy. So think about that. And the reason I say that is a lot of times people think they can do that and then they don't buy, and then later on they call back the same vendor. And often what you were going to see is that people don't want to deal with you again because you've sort of broken that trust that they thought you were ready to buy, and it's probably not going to work well, or often doesn't work well. So be really cognizant of that. So to summarize that point then, when you're setting up a meeting, make sure you clarify, hey, this is just to get information, or two, hey, we've done all our homework on you and us, and we really think we want to do a deal. So have that mindset that even if you set up a meeting, you distinguish between those two things. Before you start negotiating, one, you want to vet out the other company. Two, you want to vet out their product. And then you want to do the groundwork for negotiations. So you don't necessarily just want to go into negotiations. You need to do some groundwork. What does that groundwork entail? Well, first of all, you have to, research the company. You have to research their products. You have to research their competitors. You have to research everything about them and see if it actually even makes sense. Because you need to do your homework, because once you start negotiations, it's not the right time to figure out this isn't the right company, they don't have the right product, it's not the right situation. Again, this will hurt you if you make these discoveries after you start negotiation. So doing the groundwork before you start negotiation is critical. And of course, as I iterated, part of this really revolves around looking at their products, looking at their competitors, also understanding how their financial structure is set up, how they make their money. If all of this is not done at the beginning and you discover this in the midst of negotiations and find out things that really is not going to make sense for you, it's going to be very tough to backpedal your way when you're halfway through negotiations. The other really quick tip that I would say is, and this has happened to me, where people have come to our company, wanted to negotiate with us, and then basically at the start of the negotiations, they want me to basically read them all the information we have on our website about what we do. When someone comes to my company and says, hey, tell me all about everything you do, sometimes I want to say, well, you know what, why don't you read our website first? And once you understand what we do, I'm more than happy to give you more details. But if you're giving them the ABCs about what your company does, or if you're forcing someone to give you the ABCs of the basic structure of what their company does, where they're located, how many locations they have, things that you could easily get off their website, are probably not things you want to be asking if you're in the beginnings of negotiation. It's a little bit different if you're having a meeting about just getting information. But if you're starting earnest negotiations and you want to know, obvious things about their services, their locations, where they are, it's probably not a good time. And actually, as we're going to talk about in preparing, having that information will make you look like a more credible partner in negotiation, because you've already gone to the meeting and said, oh, yeah, we already know you're in these 5 states. That's really good for us. And we know you've already, worked in this industry, and that's going to work for us. And so all of that will work in your favor. So big rule, it's a kind of a joke, but never really ask someone to essentially read their website to you as part of the negotiations. Okay, so let's talk about more preparations for negotiation. The first thing you have to prepare are stuff that you need to know about you. When you're approaching another company or organization, you need to understand what you actually need or want from this organization. What are your goals in negotiating with them? And lastly, what do you consider a win? I mean, what do you really want to get out of this? I mean, what would be the ideal situation? You need to understand that, and you need to have a firm grip on what a win looks like for you before you even start talking with the other company. Because if you don't know what a win looks like for you, it's going to be very hard to know where to stop and push and pull when you're in the thick of negotiations. The other things you need to know besides what's a win for you, you need to know what are deal killers for you. Like what are absolute things that you can't live with? Because if you don't know what the deal killers are for you, and you start going down the negotiating path, and then after you get a deal realize, oh well, no, we're going to need that service in these 3 states and you're not there. After you cut a deal, it's not a good time to figure out what the deal killers are for you. So you need to know what certain terms that there's no way you can live with. And if those come up in negotiations, you need to understand that, make it clear, what are things that are going to kill the deal for you. The flip side, of course, is what can you live without, right? So we always have like a list of 10 things that we want, 5 things that we want. But, if we got 4 out of the 5, could we live without the 5th? You need to decide that up front. So you need to understand when you're looking at all your goals, what are the must-haves and what are the ones you can live without? Now, you're going to try to get everything you want, but at least you need to know what you can theoretically live without. And you don't want to discover that after you've cut the deal. The more you understand what your team can live with and what you cannot live with prior to starting the negotiations, the more you're going to appear to be negotiating in good faith, because at the meeting you can say, all that sounds good, but this we can't do without, or this we have to have. And the more of that information you have when you're in the thick of negotiations, the more credible you're going to appear. Okay, so now you've done the homework on you. Well, now you have to do homework on them before the negotiations, right? So you need to understand, who are they? Are they a vendor? Are they a client? And, who are you going to be meeting with? Are you going to be meeting with a person who is not the real negotiator for that company, who's there just to give you information? Or are you going to be meeting with someone who actually has the authority and is the person you want to be negotiating with? So understanding who you're going to be talking to and who they are is really important. Let's take a look at their company. You have to understand what the products they have, what their needs are, what their goals are, what do they want, what's a win for them like, right? Because if you don't know what a win for them looks like, it's going to be hard for you to cut a deal, because at the end of the day, if it's not a win for them on some level, why would they do a deal? So the best negotiations I've seen are people who understand what a win for them looks like before they enter the negotiations, and they know what a win looks like for the other side before they enter the negotiations, because that's really the road you want to head down. Because if you want to get things that are important to you, you got to understand what's going to be important to them. Are you their ideal client? Is this a killer deal for them? Is this something they like? Is this in their wheelhouse? Maybe it's not in their wheelhouse. For example, if someone comes to my office and says, "Oh, I want to talk to you about, replacing your current shredding company with my shredding company." Honestly, while that may be something important to them, it's not important to me. I'm happy with my shredding company. So if you're trying to negotiate with someone who doesn't have any interest in what you're doing, even though if it's a service they may need, you got to be careful. So you have to understand, are you important to them? Is this something they want? How important it is? Where is it in their hierarchy? How much of a win-win is it if they negotiate and come up with a deal with you? One of the things about researching the people that you're going to be meeting with is also to, look up their LinkedIn profile, find out what schools they've been to, find out what their interests are. Often one of the biggest icebreakers in, when you're negotiating with someone, hey, you know what? I saw you went to UCLA too. I saw that, you're volunteering in this charity. I'm really fond of that charity. These are all things that, one, develop some commonality, but it also shows them how serious you are. There's nothing worse than somebody coming to, your office and saying, oh, what's your title? Who are you? I'm here to negotiate with you. That's probably not going to be a good strategy. So investing in some time in understanding who they are, what their company is all about, is probably going to be a win for you. Find out who they are, what they're interested in, where they went to school, as much as you can. Read the website inside out, how many locations they have. The more info you have, the more appealing you will be when you're talking with them. In summary then, what we're saying is, does your business make economic sense for the other side? If it doesn't, if it's not a high priority or it doesn't make them money or is not important in their business plans, you need to know that, because you're going to have a very tough time trying to negotiate with someone who doesn't feel that you're relevant to what they're doing. Now, the more relevant you are, the more likely they are to sit down and cut a deal with you. You need to have a sense of that before you go into the negotiation. All right, so let's talk about negotiations. Well, it's going to be no secret that in any negotiation, the key is leverage, right? Who needs who more? Who has the financial leverage on the other person? Who can make more money from the other person? Who actually needs the service? Who doesn't need the service? I think we all understand whenever we're negotiating, we always understand if we're negotiating from a position of strength or potentially a position of weakness, or sometimes it's mutual. But I think most of us get a sense of it, and this should not be a surprise for you when you go into the negotiation. So if you're starting negotiations where you have the leverage, maybe they're coming to you and they want to sell something to you that you ideally could potentially do, but you don't need to do. You may be holding some of the leverage, and of course you can imagine a scenario where they are. And it's very, very important to understand this concept of leverage before you start it, because how you approach the deal may impact on whether you think you have more leverage than they do. So, leverage on the most broad sense is who needs who more. I guess you could look at it that way, but, even if somebody needs someone more than the other person, it doesn't mean that the person who needs the person less doesn't also want the relationship. So the concept of leverage means on some level who can live if the deal falls apart better. But that can be different magnitudes for both parties, even the party with leverage and the one without. At the end of the day, leverage can be a lot of things. It can be financial, who needs the money, who doesn't need the money, who has more money, who, this is not their line of work, they don't want to deal with it, it's too much brain damage. Leverage can mean anything in any business. What's interesting is, though, what I have found is that even though leverage can change across different businesses and across different situations, often the two parties in the relationship can sense who has, more leverage than the other person. But, one important thing is, even if you have more leverage than the other person, it doesn't mean you don't want the deal or the deal won't benefit you. So it's a real intangible, but clearly the balance of powers is often tilted one way or another. And there are different factors like finances and situations, location, how much effort is involved, how much money is involved. All of these things can impact leverage. So it's a very complicated thing, but it's interesting, even though it's so complicated, when people are in the situation, they often know if they have the upper hand or they don't, interestingly. In terms of leverage, though, there's what I call concrete leverage, where it's clear financially, in terms of who's a bigger business or other concrete facts, who's holding the leverage. But what I think most people don't understand is that you can have perceived leverage that often is intangible. And we're going to talk a lot about that, especially how you use perceived leverage when you don't have the actual concrete leverage. Okay, so this is going to be a big part of negotiating, which is how do you muster up perceived leverage when you don't have necessarily the concrete leverage. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So when you have the concrete leverage and it's on your side, I think a lot of people are tempted to, use that as a hammer. But what I have found is that when you have concrete leverage, if you're gracious and you don't let on that you have the concrete leverage and see what kind of deal you can strike without taking out that hammer, often I have found that you get so much goodwill out of that you're going to get even a better deal than if you brought out the hammer, right? So often, it's unnecessary to say, we have 4 other people lined up that want to do this deal with us, so you're lucky you're even sitting here. That's not a win for you. That's just not. And if you can be gracious and magnanimous and pretend or at least come off as you need them as much as they need you, I have found that, human nature, people are attracted to other people who give them mutual respect and dignity. And even if you have that leverage, if you can hold back and allow them to give you their best offer, what I have found is not only are you going to potentially get a better offer, but their level of commitment, their level of wanting to do more deals with you, and their level of referring other people to you. Often, when you're negotiating a deal, that's not the last deal potentially. There may be other deals that they have or their affiliate companies have. So how you treat companies and individuals when you have the leverage actually goes a long way as, first of all, creating your reputation as someone who negotiates in good faith and is fair. And I think you've heard this all the time where people say, oh yeah, they're really fair, they're great to negotiate. So there is no need to put on full display that you have leverage over them. And it's much better to be gracious, classy, and magnanimous in negotiation. Now, obviously, if you don't get the deal that you want, you don't have to do it. You may have to sort of slowly let on that, that you're going to need more than that to do the deal. But again, I think this need to hit them right over the head in round one often is unnecessary. I think even when you have leverage, people know it without you bringing it up, and it's just much more gracious, and I have found that it works better if you don't bring it up. Now, I think this is the interesting part. What do you do when you don't have the leverage, right? When you don't have the concrete leverage? Where do you go from there? Well, first of all, I hope you're dealing with a company or a person that I just described to you who's magnanimous and is not going to hit you over the head with the fact that they have all the leverage or they're holding all the cards and you're just lucky to be even there talking with them, right? That's probably, if you're getting that, besides this negotiating this deal, you have to decide if this is somebody you even want to work with, right? Because we just described how important it is to be classy and, not to do one deal with someone and do many deals with them. But assuming they're not hitting you over the head, you understand that you don't have the leverage. So what can you do? Well, the number one thing that I have found that often works for you when you don't have the leverage is personal relationships. And that, really goes to laying the groundwork before the leverage of, connecting with them personally, having meetings that, didn't have anything to do with the leverage, finding commonality. And often a lot of this has to do with personal relationship, also mutual relationships that you have. Are there people in the industry that you know? Are there societies in the industry that you belong to? I think a lot of people, human nature being what it is, like to work with people that they like and like to work with people that they have common interest in. So when you don't have leverage, this idea of building a personal relationship, laying the groundwork before the meeting to interact with them personally, and often, that means, if you're going to be negotiating with someone where you don't think you have leverage, maybe flying out to meet them and having dinner first before the meeting, going to a baseball game, catching, some social event, going out for drinks prior to the negotiations, if you can do it. Now, sometimes you can't do that. But when you don't have leverage, this stuff becomes huge, huge, huge. A Zoom meeting is not ideal when you don't have leverage, right? So those are the times you want to kind of insist, listen, we don't mind flying out to see you guys. We love it, And so you can actually create a position where even though you don't have leverage, you can develop some personal connection with them by meeting with them in person, interacting with them. Now, that doesn't always work, but it certainly is much more important when you don't have the leverage to try to develop that kind of relationship. And then last thing I want to talk about is this concept of abstract leverage, right? Abstract leverage is really something that you pretty much can create out of thin air. And what do I mean by abstract leverage? I'm talking about leverage that doesn't necessarily even exist, but you basically created it. I'll give you an example. I was asked to help an organization negotiate their lease for the place that they were renting, and it was their last year of the lease before they moved out. They wanted to get terms on their last year for their lease, and the landlord knew it was the last year of their lease, so they were in no mood to negotiate because why should they? There's only 1 year left. They want a 1 year lease, and then they're leaving. So these are the terms. Who cares? Take it or leave it. And so in sitting in that situation and saying, oh my gosh, we have no leverage, the concept came to me, and again, these are things that you have to think about depending on the situation, to tell the landlord, well, listen, you know what? We've been tenants of yours for 10 years, and we're leaving in a year. But you know what? More than likely, any new tenant that you get is probably going to know we were your last tenant for 10 years. And, it wouldn't be totally crazy for them to call us and find out what it was like working with you guys. So as we're negotiating this last year, it's probably in your best interest, for us to leave with a good taste on our mouth so we can say great things about you as a landlord. Now, that's an example of abstract leverage. We didn't really have that leverage until we thought of that leverage. So you basically have to create scenarios where the person who has the concrete leverage sees that there's some value in negotiating with you because of some intangible thing that you can potentially provide them or give them. And this concept of abstract leverage is very hard to come up with unless you're in a specific situation. But often you can actually come up with something that will be a win for them if they negotiate with you, right? So it may be that you're part of a society that they're involved in, and obviously it's a win for them if you have great things to say about them, or you may be able to refer clients to them that they currently don't have access to. You may be, on a board somewhere where there are members there that they want to potentially have a relationship with. These are all abstract leverage, and I think before you go into these meetings, if you don't have the leverage, I think it's really important to say, hey, where can I get abstract leverage so I can bring it up and say, listen, I think we can help you guys in this area. So I hope that makes sense. So think about that before you go into a situation where you don't have the leverage. All right, so let's talk about the actual negotiations. So one of the mistakes that I often see when people go into negotiations is they actually come out with what they want, meaning what terms would make them happy. And, while that kind of makes sense, I often find that may work against you, because what I have found is sometimes when you don't actually give them the terms that you think is fair, you never know that they may actually give you terms that were better than you thought. So never, ever, if you can avoid it, put your ass on the table first. So what you want to do is, say things like, well, let me ask you guys, what do you normally do in a situation like this? How do we set up a win-win? What do you guys think is fair in these kind of situations? Things like that. If there is a way you could let them put out their best scenario first, often it gives you a glimpse of what you're dealing with. So obviously, if they put out something better than you thought, that's obviously going to be a good thing for you. Now, if it's worse than you thought, then it kind of tells you how far you have to climb. But you really want to take their temperature and not disclose what is an ideal term for you. So once you get that, let's talk about then what happens when they give you their terms. Well, first of all, let's talk about concessions. Okay, so whenever you hear all the terms that you're going to be thrown at, the one thing that I have often found is find terms that, you know what appears like a concession to them, you didn't even want anyway. So certain aspects of their offer are going to be things you can certainly live without. However, you can make it sound like you're willing to make those concessions. And the best way to make a concession is by a strategy called if-then. So if someone says, these are our terms, this is like a 36-month deal, blah, 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 blah. And you can live with 36 months. But if you were then say, well, listen, 36 months, okay, that's a long time. But let me ask you a question. If we could live with 36 months, do you think we could get the payments plan to be spread out over 5 months? So basically, it's a strategy of if-then. So if you're going to agree, never just say, fine, we're okay with 36 months. If you're going to be okay with 36 months, instead of saying, we're okay with 36 months, the strategy is to say, if we can live with 36 months, then can you blah, blah, blah. Does this make sense? So it's a if-then, if-then. So whatever you're going to concede to, I wouldn't just say, oh, we're okay with that. I would say, if we could, then could you? If we could do this, then could you do that? If we did this, then could you do that? And actually, that appeals to people's sense of fairness, right? Saying, if I could do this, then could you do that in exchange? And I think as you're making concessions with things that you can live without, then you can start adding the things that you actually really, really need, if that makes sense. So obviously, if they get to a deal killer one, that's going to be tough. But if you've had a series of concessions that you've already agreed to, and then you finally say, on that one, we don't have any room, you're going to sound much more reasonable than if you've been just saying no to everything. So again, you need to know before the meeting starts what you can concede, okay? And you want to concede to the things you can live without, but with every concession, you want to extract something that you absolutely need. And this is the strategy. So focus on the things that you can give up, but then use that as a lever to get the things you absolutely need. Last thing I want to talk about is if negotiations fail. What I have seen when negotiations fail is, there's really two approaches. If negotiations fail because you've already sized up that the other party is dealing in bad faith, or you're just not a fit for them, you're not the type of client they need or want, then, that's an issue and you may just have to walk away. But if negotiations fail because you just couldn't agree on terms, but, you got 80% of it, there was 20% that you couldn't, leaving the door open to fight another day is always a great strategy. So the strategy of saying, listen, we've agreed on a lot. There's some area here that we don't agree. But here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to take this back to my team. Maybe we could set up another time to meet in a week or however long, and then see what we can do to close the gap. Because I think when enough time goes by, and certainly often from even the other side, they realize that they may have more give, or your team may realize that there's some barter chip that you may have where you can barter something for another. Because I have found that with advantage of some time or a week, you may come up with solutions to get over some of these impasses that you can't think in the spur of the moment. So rather than saying, hey, we agree on 80%, but these 20% we can't agree, let's call it a day, just setting up another time to renegotiate. Often people get battle fatigue during these negotiations, and emotions run high. I think when you let enough time go by and people cool down and people understand that you're this close and you just need to iron out a few details, people become more flexible, people become innovative. People think of solutions that you can't think of at the spur of the moment, right? So there have been many times where we thought we couldn't live with something, but when we went back and re-engineered and rethought it, like, yeah, maybe if we did this, move this around, then we can live with that. So what seems like an impossible impasse is not an impasse sometimes, with the advantage of time. So always buy yourself time if you're close, and fight, live to fight another day. That is my whole thing on negotiation. The last thing as a bonus I want to give you is this thing when you're negotiating, is this concept of, what I call brain damage. How much brain damage is it going to be working with you or vice versa? And I think what I have found is that when you're negotiating, if you really want to get as much as you can that's important to you, conveying that you're easy to work with, that you're going to be a low maintenance client or vendor or what have you, often sends a message that even if it's not the perfect deal for them, in essence, it's going to be so easy to deal with you that even if they don't get everything they want, it's still a good deal. So this concept that you're a mensch, you're negotiating good faith, and you're not going to be a high maintenance partner or client goes a long way in sealing the deal. So how you convey that pre-negotiations, during negotiations, even as you're sealing the deal, you want to come off as a low maintenance client, someone who's going to be minimal brain damage. You want to be sending that message at every point of the negotiations. Dealing with you guys, meaning you, is going to be literally minimal brain damage. And so it's going to make those things that are on the fence sometimes tilt in your favor, if that makes sense. Okay, well, thank you so much. Listen, if you like this kind of content, please comment, like, and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want more episodes like this, if you want other topics that you want me to discuss in terms of leadership and growing your organization, please leave it in the comment section below. Thank you so much, and take care. Bye-bye.